context, I believe, is really part of a larger story of Asia-Pacific integration. And therefore, I was very pleased at the previous session. Ambassador Kumar made a very sort of, emphatic point that staying out of the global system is not an option. It's not perfect by any stretch of imagination, issues, but staying out of it is actually worse. So given that premise, Mr. Chairman, I would like to propose there are 7 areas, significant areas of cooperation for India, ASEAN, and indeed the other countries that I mentioned. There will be, of course, many other subsets, but the principal 7, in my opinion. First, trade. We have to recognize that the FTAs that, again, the previous session was so eloquently discussed, is just one part of the whole equation of greater trade of goods and services and investments, and that is how the regions will prosper. Now, FTAs, whether it's the Indian-ASEAN FTA or the other FTAs, are all creating a bit of a rice bowl or a noodle bowl effect, and not always very efficient, and marked by disappointments on both sides at times, or various sides. But the fact remains that Indo-ASEAN relationships expanding to China and beyond really would be trade-driven. And I'm not talking just about a mercantilist type of an approach, but it will be part of a global value chain, part of a regional value chain. And indeed, the whole success of ASEAN is really it becoming a part of the regional value chain with East Asia. And I think that concept of trade integration is going to be very important. RCEP is on the cards, and I am very hopeful that the 16 countries, particularly with TPP now sort of, shouldn't say off the table, but certainly sort of has taken a hit. The RCEP will become even more important. And I think India and China should obviously be very major drivers of that process. TPP -1, if it happens, that's something that India should reflect on, and also reflect on whether there is space or need for TPP and RCEP. My own bias is towards an RCEP with India and China, Japan, Korea, and other Asian countries being very much, and the ASEAN countries being very much in the driver's seat. But FTAs, RCEP, all of these trade bloc arrangements, as we know, are always second best. And the ultimate first best, which is the culmination of a global trading arrangement, we'll wait to see what happens. But we also need to recognize that non-tariff barriers are just as important. As a matter of fact, after the India-ASEAN FTA in goods and services, tariffs are no longer the binding constraint. What is a binding constraint are the non-tariff barriers, choke points at the borders, essentially thick borders. And then the challenge has to be through appropriate software, single customs, lack of, or more standardization, reduced corruption in border crossings, reduced documentation. Basically have a thin border in this whole region to make the dreams of an India, ASEAN, multipolar Asia reality. That's number 1. Number 2 is connectivity. And again, Ambassador, you have very eloquently talked about it. The previous session has talked about it. Ambassador Bhatia referred in his opening remarks. And I think, again, we have to be very honest about it. Intentions have been good. Implementation has not. And Ambassador Kumar in the previous session highlighted that point. But we've got to think of the Asian Highway, the Asian Railway, the Belt Road Initiative, the Kaladan model, the IMT. Many of these are a necessary but not sufficient condition for Asian integration. But without connectivity, and I just don't mean physical connectivity, you mentioned maritime, digital, other forms, energy, all of those are a part of connectivity. Yes, resources are going to be critical. But I personally don't think resources are the binding constraint. The multilateral institutions, now joined by AIIB and NDB, and more importantly, the private sector. The resources are there if the political leadership, if the preparation of the projects, if the institutional arrangements are firmly put in place. And when we talk about connectivity, I think it obviously goes without saying that there is a large amount of intra-India connectivity, particularly in the Northeast, which is very important. So India cannot get well connected to Myanmar and then Thailand, then on to ASEAN, east-west, north-south corridors, unless we get some very major bottlenecks in our own northeastern states in place. So that's obviously a very important point. Third, I would think macroeconomic and financial cooperation. It is still odd manifestation of Asia's rise, relative rise, that Asia saves the most. Our savings ratios are roughly about 32% of GDP, and yet we rely on financial markets in the West to finance investments, to finance trade. Now, I'm not speaking about this in a parochial sense. My point is that greater financial integration, greater ability to invest across borders, greater mobilization of Asian savings for Asian investments obviously makes more sense. And there have been, of course, developments on that front. Since the '97 financial crisis, the Asian Bond Market Initiative, the credit guarantee facilities, but still Asian financial sector, remains very much a bank-dominated financial sector. And unless and until the capital markets are developed, and the capital markets are developed in a regional sense, you really would not be seeing adequate progress on integration. A case in point, and I never tire of this example, a Thai investor wanting to invest in bahts in Laos finds it easier to go to London and through London invest in Laos rather than just across the border. That's because of the very thick borders we have in the financial markets. And the same applies to South Asia and other parts of the region. So that's the third area that I see of great cooperation potential in Asia. A fourth, I would say, is access to natural resources. When we talk about India, ASEAN, and China, Japan, there is an intrinsic assumption here that we are looking east, and that's important, but there's a huge area on the west, which is also part of Asia. How about the energy sources in Central Asia? How do we tap them to serve the markets in China, serve the markets in South Asia? The TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, for example. But there are challenges to those. How do we develop river basins, Mekong, Ganga? That's something that we've talked about a lot. And other than some slight progress on the navigation side, water navigation side, we really haven't tapped the exploitation of the river potential of this region. The huge hydropower potentials in Nepal and Laos, for example, and Bhutan, still go untapped because we have not been able to get a regional perspective of energy sharing. So if Nepal and India were to develop, one being a hydropower potential rich, the other being starved of electricity, huge demand, similarly Laos and Thailand, the sharing and access of natural resources obviously is one area of great potential for cooperation. And again, I don't want to sound parochial. I'm not talking about Asia as Fortress Asia. I am talking about Asia integrated with the world, but obviously it makes much more sense economically, politically, and otherwise to look closer to home. And therefore, the huge markets of China and India, these two countries alone can drive the demand for natural resources, for any other products that one can think of, if only we could think beyond immediate national borders. Fifth would be climate change. This is one area where I think, though both India and China have, I think, in the recent years, particularly after Mr. Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord, I think both India and China have shown leadership, but it's not enough. And I'll just give you a very simple example, and it's very telling. A few years back at the Asian Development Bank, a study was done together with Cambridge University, which looked at some consequences of global warming. And it showed that if just things continue as they are, by 2100, sea levels globally would rise slightly over 50 centimeters, over 1990 levels. If that were to be so, and it's quite possible that it could be so, interestingly, 15 out of the 20 top cities affected, and many of them inundated, and 9 of the top 10 would be in Asia. And it's not just we're talking about Maldives and some coastal cities in India or China. We are talking about Calcutta, we're talking about Dhaka, we're talking about Bangkok. And this is not a out-of-the-line projection. This was essentially a very realistic scenario that this modeling projected, of course, like all models, subject to assumptions. But the basic point is that Asia needs to think of climate change for its very survival, not just economic survival, but just survival. And the sixth would follow in terms of responding to common regional threats, be it natural disasters, epidemics, drugs, or whatever. Every year, Singapore and Malaysia suffered the consequences of forest fires in Indonesia. Within the subcontinent, the stubble burning in Punjab affects the rest of India. So it's not a regional issue, but the same sort of considerations apply. So the environmental issues, the deforestation issues, the trade issues, the trafficking issues are all regional in character. So talking about human trafficking, talking about illegal trade or drugs, all have to be considered within that context. And the seventh and the last, and I'm certainly no expert in that area, and other people would be much more capable of commenting on it, but I think there are huge security implications for greater regional cooperation or the lack of it. And I know that a point is made, and I can empathize with that, that greater connectivity somehow endangers security because you make it possible for people to move, and with people, other things move, including terrorism, including insurgents, etc. I would submit that the position, at least I take, is just the opposite. I think enhanced connectivity actually enhances security. Once you're invested in another country, once you're invested in your neighbor, you have greater incentives to not go to war or not go to do things which are detrimental because what goes around comes around. So security, in a broader sense, I think is served better by greater regional cooperation. Now, those are the broad 7 points, Mr. Chairman, I thought I'll put on the table. The way I see it, as Ambassador Kumar had said in the previous session, that I don't think we have a choice. It's a question of how well we'll do it, and the consequences of not doing well will not be just a zero-sum game that somebody will be better off and somebody will be worse off. I think we'll all be worse off, and that's not an outcome anybody desires. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rajat, for an excellent presentation. This comes to you naturally from all the years that you have put in running the Asian Development Bank. You are able to take the broad view of what is happening in sub-regions and regions and in Asia as a whole, whereas many of us here are stuck in terms of reflecting on managing relationships between two regions or sub-regions or even nations. I think the 7-point agenda makes a great deal of sense, especially when you talk about the economic aspects of Asia's integration, and you make it clear that you're not talking of a fortress Asia, but perhaps an Asia which is very well integrated with the rest of the world. The only point on which perhaps there could be debate, and naturally that would take place later, is the impact of geopolitics on these economic considerations and economic rationale. Is it not possible to conceive that geopolitics ends up trumping geoeconomics, pure economic considerations? But that is something that probably we might take it up later, depending on the interest of the panelists and the audience. Thank you, Rajat, once again. May I now invite Dr. Phillips Vermonte to address you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman, Ambassador Bhatia. And then I'd like to start with thanking RIS for inviting me, especially Dr. Prabir Dey. This is my first time to India, but I'm not going to put any maps. So if I miss some points on India, please forgive me. But we just had our first security dialogue with Indian counterpart in December, about 3 weeks ago, with the DPG, Delhi Policy Group, and of which Ambassador Birananda was a member. So to me, it's incredible that within that short time span, I engaged twice with Indian colleagues in the discussion of our strategic partnership between India and Indonesia, and India and ASEAN. Much has been said since the morning, so it seems to me that I would speak at the risk of repeating some of the themes that have been discussed. So I'd like to divide my presentation into two parts. Number one, I'd like to repeat and bring us back to the reality where we are today in terms of world politics. And that, I think, will affect the way we see ourselves, the way we see our relationship between our two entities. And then in the second part, after laying out what I think about what has been happening globally, then how we can put ourselves, how India and Indonesia fit in that kind of a scenario. Now, it goes without saying that we are now living in uncertainty as we know it. President Trump is pressing the reset buttons on so many things. I agree with Ambassador Rajat earlier that probably climate change is one of the areas that we need to work more, but with the US is withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, that would allay the pressure of which country will take the lead, has the resources, and so on and so forth. And that might give China some role of leadership in that, ironically, in that particular issue. Now, secondly, at the global level, I think we have all heard about the disappointment of the nature of the international order. The US complaining, especially President Trump. The Chinese are complaining as well on the nature of the international order. If you ask the Russians as well, they are complaining. At the regional level, people in Europe complaining about European Union, at least the British, and they have said, and they have decided. So now it seems that we are questioning all the international order. And that might be a sign of the withdrawal of a superpower, and of course the rise of a new, potentially superpower. And the rise of China is now probably turning into, or already the eruption of China. China's investment is everywhere, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. About a few months ago, they released the target of sending tourists in the next 5 years in the range of 300 million Chinese tourists across the globe. So you can imagine Indonesia has only 250 people. But China targets that it will send 300 million tourists across the globe. That will affect the economy of the country that become the target of these tourists. We are not talking about hard security issues, but we are talking about something that China is able to be doing. Number 4, we have global hotspots that until today we don't know how to solve. The Korean Peninsula, the Middle East, and in our part of the world is the South China Sea, which all points to the weakness of the international community or the international law, at least in terms of enforcement. Who will be able to enforce international law? Right now, we don't have any country. The US has no interest, it seems to me. China has yet to reach that level of being a superpower that can provide international public goods, which are security, peace, and stability. So maybe we are also estimating China here. So we are in doubt whether the US under President Trump, maybe in the next 4 years, or if he got reelected, then we have to live with President Trump for 8 years, whether the US can continue its play to provide this international public goods. If the US cannot, will China step in? But if China step in, will China act as a belligerent power or benign power? We have yet to see. But so far the evidence points that China is potentially not so benign power. But the US also is not a benign power right now in the eyes of many Southeast Asian countries. So we are ending up having potentially 2 belligerent superpowers. And that affects the way countries, at least in Southeast Asia, sees how we engage with the US and how we engage with China. Number 4, because of this uncertainty, I think we have to look at the emergence of the new geopolitical map. And it's been discussed in our discussion with the Indian counterparts last month, that we have now 2 blocks, so to speak. Number 1 is the Eurasian versus the Atlantic. It's the traditional geopolitical competition that we have seen for decades. But secondly, we have, I think, the competition between the continental and the maritime, which, of course, Indonesia is part of this maritime. And as far as I understand, India sees itself as a maritime country as well. But I'd like to deepen on that particular aspect, that we are, both Indonesia and India, are not only a maritime country, but maritime democracies. This is something that I've learned from the dialogue that we have. The term maritime democracy that add something that can be used as a base for deepening cooperation with India. So we have maritime democracies: India, Australia, Indonesia, New Zealand, Japan, and the Philippines, probably, if you agree. So then how we see these pictures of uncertainty and this global competition, where India, Indonesia, and ASEAN fit in all the equation. Now there's a question. Number 1, will India start acting like a regional or global power? And this is actually a title of an article, appears in the latest edition of Foreign Affairs. And it's very persuasive argument that India has to start acting like a global power, not only regional power, because of these several reasons. Number 1, India is the 3rd largest military in the world in terms of personal strength. India is the 5th largest country in terms of defense budget. As I understand, it's now $60 billion US, equals 1.9 of your GDP, 1.9%, while Indonesia only 7.7 billion US dollar. This is a number from 2016, I guess, which less than 1% of the Indonesian GDP. India also is the 7th largest economy and has, of course, the sizable middle class. And some has mentioned India as the net provider of regional security. So with all these modalities, from the lens of the security perspective, India has this modality to act like a regional or global power. Indonesia has been mentioned as well as the natural leader of ASEAN, but yet some countries are frustrated with the way Indonesia conduct its leadership in ASEAN in the past few years. So are we, both India and Indonesia, punching below our weight? That's, I think, the question that we need to ponder. I don't know the answer, I'm just throwing the idea here. So I think the India's Act East policy is related, as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, will be connected with how Indonesia conduct its leadership in Southeast Asian countries. So somebody has mentioned in the earlier session that India can use ASEAN to access Chinese market. And probably India can use Indonesia to access ASEAN, in terms of strategic partnership, deepening, and so on and so forth. Now, to realize that, what are the modalities that we have, Indonesia and India? Number one, of course, we have a shared democratic experience. Although you are, of course, the oldest democracy, the older democracy compared to Indonesia, but we do share some problems with democracies. And the discussion earlier, a disagreement about the negotiations and so on and so forth, I think it's partly because we are democracies. In China, you wouldn't have that kind of disagreement because China is more authoritarian. So it's easier for China to push agenda domestically compared to both of our countries. So that, I think, we have to admit, and probably from there we can develop some opportunities. Number two, I think the modality is India has this pragmatic engagement with major powers, as well as Indonesia. India has cautious engagement with major power. That makes India not a swing state, but it's more rational state. Our counterpart in India sees India as, in the dialogue that I mentioned earlier, India as a regional balancer, although it's been denied in the discussion that India is not pursuing that way to be a balancer against China, but as a matter of fact, I think India is a regional balancer. But Indonesia is not a balancer. Indonesia sees itself as an honest broker in Southeast Asia, in South China Sea. So that, I think, where we differ. But Indonesia and India prefers, as mentioned earlier as well by Ambassador Rajat, that we want to have a regional multipolar stability. That said, no country should dominate our part of the world. And we both want regional order based on cooperation. Indonesia, as has been mentioned earlier in the sessions, is the second largest trading partner of India in South China Sea. And then we have this situation where I think we have to clearly see how we position ourselves, especially against China. Indonesia and ASEAN are not the balancer of China, but we are doing what we call hedging. So we try to benefit from both, from China and from the United States, for that matter. What we are doing, I think, and what India, I think, is doing is just soft balancing. Because number one, we don't have credibility to do hard balancing against China. So what we are doing is, and what is China doing against the United States is soft balancing, using non-military factors to make the other side frustrated. Using institution, China is using economic statecraft, providing development assistance, and so on and so forth. That is hard to be matched by the US or by India or by Japan, because China is now the engine of growth of the global economy. As far as ASEAN is concerned, ASEAN has long been trying to maintain equidistant policies towards great power. In the beginning, in the first decades of ASEAN, in the 1970s, 1980s, the idea is to keep major power outside ASEAN, to keep them to keep them at the distance. That's why we have this TAC and so on and so forth, the ASEAN document. But since 1990s, as we have this globalization, APEC, and all this free trade initiatives, WTO has come to work, ASEAN mode of cooperation with major power is engagement. We engage major powers, creating +3 and plus so on and so forth, ARF and so on and so forth. So you see, ASEAN always change in the way it is dealing with the regional outside power. But since 2000s, ASEAN has become, if I may, leaderless. And this is probably the perils of democracy. Democracy comes to Southeast Asia. As a result, leaders come and go. So before 2000, we had long-serving leaders. They know each other. They could just pick up the phone if there's a problem, and they could agree. Suharto called Lee Kuan Yew called Marcos, and so on and so forth. Now, no more. It's new leaders coming. They respond to their electoral pushes domestically. And this is something I think that ASEAN countries, especially Indonesia, can learn from India, of how domestic constituency affect the way India conducts foreign policy. From a closed economy, now I've heard that India is trying very hard to reform. So as a result, we don't have a non-unified ASEAN. If you expect ASEAN to be unified, I think you need to lower your expectation because of all the above factors. Next, the fact is that we are all, including India, as well as China, are developing countries. We have our own domestic problem. As much as we want to balance China, in the end, because we are a developing country, there's this development interest. And China themselves, I think, also consider this factor, that China have yet to answer whether China is developed or developing countries. Of course, in my eyes, China is developing countries prone to problems that all developing countries are facing. Inequalities across region, poverty, climate, corruption, and so on and so forth. Now, as far as Indonesia and India is concerned, there are things that we can do. Number one, Ambassador Pousutirak in the first session told us that there's a lack of trust between ASEAN countries and India as far as the intention of India is concerned. But I think India can do more, doing more PR activities, if you may, cultural and so on. But there's example of the way India approached development in Southeast Asia compared to China. I understand you have, for example, infrastructure project in Myanmar and also in some other countries, but the difference with China is that this Indian assistance, the airport in the Philippines that mentioned earlier, the ownership is in the hands of the recipient countries. While China, as we have heard about the problem in Sri Lanka and other, so you see which one is more benign in terms of development assistance. So this kind of thing, I think, would increase trust between our countries, ASEAN and India. Number two, I think we have to focus. There's a bucket of the list of, a shopping list of what we can do. But I think ASEAN and India needs to focus on certain things, given the modality that I've mentioned earlier. And that certain thing, I would say, is maritime link cooperation. In terms of security, access to natural resources, somebody in the first session already mentioned this, and in particular, building awareness of the maritime domain. That can be done through IORA or to ASEAN, although it would not be easy. IORA with 20-something members, most of them are less developed countries. So far, only India and Australia, and to some extent Indonesia, are the ones that can provide to some extent resources for that to be realized. But this maritime link cooperation, I think, is very important. Fourth, cyber security. India is the match, I think, to China when it comes to ICTs and so on, which, in my knowledge, so far, there's no regional or international regime that regulates cyber security. At least we can start from there. Fourth, I think, if I may, my last, yes. Professor Baladas earlier, Gozal proposed the Quad. I would propose the trilateral dialogue between India, Japan, and Indonesia, which are maritime democracies. The dialogue that would realize this maritime link cooperation, that would be less sensitive compared to if we include 2 or 3 more ASEAN countries. That will, of course, alert China and also alert other Asian countries. So with that, I should stop. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for such a broad-ranging assessment of the strategic aspects of the scenario, both at the global level and then focused specifically on the situation in Asia. I think you have brought in some very interesting insights from Indonesia. Let me assure you that among Indian scholars, there is a huge interest, huge interest in terms of Indonesia's mindset. So when I take copious notes of what you said, 2 things strike me tremendously. When you say that there is a perception in Indonesia that both India and Indonesia punch below the weight, this comes as quite a surprise to us, because probably most perceptions here would be that while India punches on its weight or maybe a little above its weight, Indonesia certainly punches below its weight. But the other remark that you made, the other remark of your assessment, was even more significant when you said that both US and China are potentially belligerent nations in Asia. Now this, for people in New Delhi in particular, might sound something very debatable, because talking quite honestly, despite all the economic dependence and so on, or interdependence, clearly India's national security policy has much to take into account the actual behavior of China. And India does look towards the US as a very important strategic partner. But still, in terms of Indonesian perception, that certainly both these powers cause concern, that is something very significant. We have also noted your remarks about India-Indonesia relations and Indonesia's role in ASEAN. These are all very creative, and we would have a chance to discuss them. I thank you very much. But really very insightful and very interesting presentation you have made. At this stage, may I now request Ambassador Anil Wadhwa to address you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, sir. I would like to, first of all, begin by saying that truly the Asian century has arrived. We have to take into account the fact that this is the region which is now driving the world economy. And with it, it has also brought about a sense of interest from the major powers around the world. They all have an interplay today in the Indo-Pacific region, which has gained currency as a terminology. It came into existence as a terminology some years ago. And at that point in time, not many paid attention to it. Well, that's happened because of the fact that security issues have got linked with the economic issues, and they cannot be now extricated from that, from each other. Naturally, therefore, there is an interest in this region from the United States, Russia, and China as the main players in the region, but also the regional countries and powers. And so India, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, etc., are all countries that are involved, very much involved in this process. The issue of South China Sea has been a major development for the region, where it's not just a dispute per se, but also the fact that international rules and order have been challenged. And not much has been done about it, and it seems unlikely that much will be done about it in the near future either, despite the fact that there has been a tremendous backlash to what has happened in the South China Sea. So India is watching this with alarm. It has watched it with alarm for a number of years now, but since we are not directly involved in the South China Sea disputes, we can only pronounce ourselves on this aspect. And we have done so by siding with ASEAN, emphasizing on ASEAN unity and centrality, and at the same time emphasizing also that given the fact that world trade passes through the sea lanes of this region, and the South China Sea is an important place today in the world, that the world rules and order must be maintained. And therefore, UNCLOS is crucial in this aspect. Now, proceeding from that, as far as Indo-Pacific is concerned, what would India like to see and do as far as ASEAN is concerned? Because we see ASEAN as central to the integration which has happened in Asia. And from that perspective, we would like to move ahead with ASEAN in blue economy and coastal surveillance, building of offshore patrolling capabilities, hydrographic services, information sharing for increased maritime domain awareness, which was mentioned by our last speaker as well. And maritime domain awareness I see as an emerging issue in the immediate future as far as India and ASEAN is concerned. Why I say that is because I do not see a security architecture emerging in the region at all. And this is a statement which is perhaps goes against the grain of what everybody has been saying, that we need a security architecture in the region. And India itself has presented a paper on a security architecture. But there are differing views. There are people who see security in the region in a different light. These are differences which, in my view, cannot be reconciled easily. It can't be reconciled easily because there are various interests involved and there are various superpowers involved. And therefore, the best that we can do is to have a regional arrangement which will take care of security. And I feel that regional arrangement cannot be done as a large grouping. It can only be done on a bilateral basis between India and ASEAN, which we've been trying to do. That itself will bring about a semblance or a core of a regional security architecture, in quotes, if I may call it that. So how does one do that? It's essentially making sure that, that to protect our sea lanes of communication, also to meet the convergences that we have between ASEAN and India, we track, first of all, things like passage and developments of naval vessels and ships in the South China Sea. We have closer defense cooperation between India and ASEAN. Already we see a great amount of cooperation bilaterally with countries like Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, and also we have some long-standing existing arrangements with countries like Malaysia and Singapore. These have emerged as, in my view, priority areas in this relationship. And so, some time ago, when people talked about Indian interest in the Straits of Malacca or Lombok or Sunda, That was something that we would always say may not have held so much of interest for us in the past, but it does now because of the developments that have taken place in this region. And that is why the cooperation with Singapore in terms of maritime domain awareness and exchange of information has also become that much important. Uh, Second, and this point has been made earlier, I think what India and ASEAN need to do is to deepen the economic integration. We've been talking about these figures, for example, ASEAN accounting for 10.2% of India's total trade, etc. But then we also had a discussion in the last session where it was clearly brought out that we are struggling to meet the $100 billion mark in bilateral trade between each other. Our trade has got stuck in the region of $76 billion at the most. And many things have happened which have affected this. One is, of course, the fact that our FTA has not worked well, if I might call it that. India would, of course, like to see the services and investment part of it also being ratified by the remaining two ASEAN countries. But at the same time, India traditionally has been a country which has looked to its domestic market and not so much is an export-driven economy. So we all keep talking about the fact that our trade is not increasing, but there's also this important factor there. But of course, time has come now, and this is what is being analyzed within the government and the academic circles in India, that for our economy to grow and to become a country with a manufacturing base which must increase to 25% of GDP, we have to adapt ourselves to a model where we export more, and therefore ASEAN becomes that much more important for us in this context. As far as RCEP is concerned, we had a big, long discussion on this in the last session. I participated towards the end, and I feel there again, there's not been much progress because of, given the experience in the past with other FTAs, the issue of movement of professionals, for instance, that has not got a good response from the RCEP participating countries, and therefore India is reluctant to open up its market for the targeted goods to that extent that it could. If we analyze our trade figures, there's been a drop in agricultural products exports from India. They face a high import tariff and barriers, NTBs as we call them, from some ASEAN countries. And that is why I still feel that we will struggle in the near future to achieve that $100 billion target. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that there is, the light has got shut out in the future. There's always hope of improving upon this because we know the problems now. Third, many of the speakers today have emphasized on the issue of connectivity. Definitely through land, sea, and air, in order to cut down the movement of costs of goods and movement of goods and services between India and ASEAN. We have talked about the trilateral highway, the other projects that we have in the regional context as well. But we never discussed the $1 billion credit line that has already been announced by India in 2015. What has happened to this issue? Basically, the fact is that to utilize this fund, ASEAN countries have to prepare projects and proposals. And that's where we've got stuck, because unless we build in a component of consultancies which will be reimbursed to this fund as well on our part, then others will be reluctant to come forward and spend so much of money on spending on consultancy fees, because these are not small projects, these are large projects. Second, there has been a credit line of $77 million which has been initiated also towards CMLV countries. And there again, the initiatives from the concerned countries have been few and far between. On the other hand, if you look at the quick impact projects which we had between India and CMLV countries, all of them have been a resounding success. They were all utilized very quickly and had a great turnover. In fact, the entire budget was taken up as soon as it was announced within 1.5 years. Then again, as far as the trilateral is concerned, it's not just the trilateral. I think what we need there is also arrangements to sustain the trilateral. And that means that there should be economic hubs of economic activity along the trilateral, where India should be talking to Myanmar, for instance, or getting third parties involved in setting up projects along the highway. So in future, if we have a railway link which runs along the highway, that could also piggyback on these projects. Otherwise, the trilateral is not going to work. And it's also not going to work if we do not have the last mile connectivity in the northeast on our side, because it cannot be a one-way street. The northeast of India will open up to the ASEAN through Myanmar and Thailand, and then we would require to see exports and imports taking place. If we have only imports taking place in the first year or so, it will be very disheartening. So I don't think a project of this size can sustain itself if not enough preparations are done. Now, everybody talks about a delay which has happened in the trilateral. I accept that there's been 4 to 5 years of delays, but at the same time, it has given time for the policymakers in India, at least, to think about what is required to make it more viable. And what I'm mentioning is just two of those things. But at the same time, how to improve the soft connectivity with Myanmar, for instance. Look at the motor vehicles agreement and look at the customs issues. How to solve them has been a major focus as well. So that has given India time and these countries time to look at these issues. We've talked about a trilateral arrangement, a motor vehicles arrangement between Thailand, Myanmar, and India, which is at an advanced stage. And that all would not have happened if we did not have this time. So in a way, it's been a blessing in disguise, in my view. And I think we should get all these things sorted out much before the trilateral opens out. Sea connectivity, and this was mentioned also by one of the previous speakers. Of course, we have the multimodal transport project, Kaladan, with Myanmar, etc. We've talked about developing the Sitwe port with Myanmar. We've also had a proposal of linking Dawei with Chennai, etc., and therefore linking up the eastern seaboard of India, ports like Ennore, etc., which will cut down shipping costs and distance. But at the same time, I think what we need to look at is also, for these proposals to succeed, shipping joint ventures between India and ASEAN on a much larger scale. And also smaller transshipment projects between our countries, especially the ASEAN countries which are closer to the Indian coastline. So an agreement on maritime transport between India and ASEAN, I believe, would cover these areas and should be seriously looked at. There is also a clear need to develop air links. We always talk about tourism awareness. It cannot happen unless all our major Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities are connected by direct flights, for instance, with all the ASEAN countries. That's not the case at the moment. So if you have Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, and now Indonesia, that's fine, but you have other countries as well. So we want to increase our linkages in tourism and in trade and in investments. Obviously, businessmen will not take the trouble to hop across two countries and get into one of the ASEAN countries and then try and do business over there. It's inconvenient. So one must look at that as soon as possible. Some arrangements have been put into place, like that with Brunei. That's not fructified, and we must look into the reasons why that has not happened. Finally, we have done, as far as India is concerned, I believe we've done our part on connectivity with ASEAN in culture to culture and people to people contacts, and also cultural cooperation, because there's been a lot of emphasis on exchange of diplomats, youth, media and intellectuals, scholarship programs, etc., with ASEAN countries. Of course, this will continue because we need to align ourselves with the ASEAN integration plan of 2025, but at the same time also enhance our cooperation in areas like food and agriculture, in education, clean and renewable energy, in tourism, in health, in SME development, which is a major sector of common to us, and poverty elimination. And then, of course, institutional linkages, which was referred to, exist. 30 of such linkages have been already put into place. But what has succeeded is the centers of excellence, for example, in English language, in IT and software development between India and ASEAN. These have all been utilized and have been huge success. These need to be ramped up. And also the additional $50 million which was announced to the ASEAN India Fund by our Prime Minister, that will be useful in conducting these activities. As far as big ticket items are concerned, I believe you'll require additional funding. Also, disaster management and humanitarian affairs assistance has been important, including risk reduction. This needs to be sustained between India and ASEAN. There is need to ramp up cooperation under the ASEAN-India Green Fund for the implementation of activities because things like climate change, adaptation, India has a lot to contribute to some ASEAN countries in this respect. We also have increased the corpus of the ASEAN-India Science and Technology Development Fund. So that's gone up from $1 million to $5 million in 2016. And that is basically meant to support collaborative R&D and technology development programs between India and ASEAN. So what has happened there is that it's been given over to corporate bodies to run. I believe there should be diversification of that fund. It should also be given over in part to governmental institutions, at least 3 or 4 of them, so that it's diversified in its implementation. More and more people should know about it. And I feel it's been underutilized, and it should be better utilized in that context. Cybersecurity was mentioned. It's very important because industrial espionage and countering cyber attacks on utilities and commercial establishments is something that we share with ASEAN. And we ourselves have proposed an innovation platform and building of digital connectivity with ASEAN. And both these, I believe, India should push forward in the future. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anil, for such a comprehensive and speedy presentation of views on a host of subjects. You were India's ambassador in Thailand and then a top policy maker here in Delhi. And so it sounds very convincing, and it is, when you put across the rationale behind some of the decisions and approaches that the government of India adopted. And this is where a bit of a dialogue of the deaf between India and ASEAN emerges, because we just heard how the speaker talked about complete lack of progress on $1 billion investment fund that India offered 3 years back. We don't hear any response whatsoever from ASEAN. When Anil talks about the special project fund of $77 million for CLMB, we don't hear a word about it. Earlier in the previous session, it was pointed out that the agreement on investment and services, which has been signed, India and ASEAN agreement, but it is held up. I can understand Mr. Vermonte will say it's not my concern. I'm a strategic guy. I do not know anything about economics. But the fact is that India and ASEAN will have to learn to talk to each other rather than talking at each other. Unless we become more frank and more candid, some of these things are just left high in the air, and that obviously then gives a chance to critics of India-ASEAN partnership to point out that nothing is happening. But be that as it may, my only point on which perhaps a debate can be initiated, Anil, is the very first line that you uttered as you started your presentation, and you said, Asian century has arrived. Now, is this the Asian century that is arriving, or is it the Chinese century, or is it the China-dominated or China-centric century that is arriving, that we are mistaking to be Asian century, Indonesian view you just heard when our friend said that actually China definitely is a potentially belligerent country, but that is something we will again leave it for a later time. I'm very happy now to request my good old friend, Professor Sutipan Chirathivat, to address you.
Thanks, my respect Chair, Ambassador Bhatia. Thanks, ASEAN India Center, or RS in particular, Prabir, for the kind invitation. And I think we had a very full day and very day that we had made important exchange to celebrate at the same time 25th ASEAN India, that's relation and partnership. I'm very pleased and privileged to add, perhaps as last speaker, which is not that easy task. That's among the old friends and both Ambassador Rajanath and Ambassador also the Anin Wadwa, who just returned from Bangkok. And add up to the last minute, and including this session, Ambassador from Vietnam who left, and Dr. Philip, the young colleague. I admire the young generation that we have, the continuation of this kind of dialogue. So this session deal exactly with ASEAN, India, and how we work, and we will be working in an integrated Asia. Of course, Asia, we're talking at whether Asia lead the world or Asia century, but Asia is integrating, continue to be integrated with the world as much as we're working among ourselves, like the way ASEAN India partnership is demonstrating. So it's very difficult to add up, but I will just be very selective, listen to what I heard since this morning, and particularly what particularly pertinent issue to this session. I would like to offer my own reflection to it, and of course, as already discussed very much, that luckily, for instance, I think this. For ASEAN integration is not like post-EU, post-Brexit EU, that's, and India is not from America, but I think it's our integration is less threatening, an economic integration, but although we also have the political one still matters, that we're talking about the way we've not been able to survive South China Sea. We have Rohingya humanitarian crisis in Myanmar, and we also have quite environmental concern that we have to manage. The best Rajiv not talking about it. That's the right of the sea. That's we impact the way we are moving to the future. And it doesn't mean that all this we can escape this very increasing uncertain world. And I think it's very important that we need to advocate that's the global issues. In particular, that's concerned economic. We're talking about the multilateralism not working well, but we have global environment, global the SDG, that is there, and it's still important. And we need to also to neither of us manage well, but be in a global context. But we are facing with this as well the global weak architecture and institution that supporting us to moving ahead. So I think we need to continue to improve the process, and our participation is still key to improve and build our future. I'm not going to go in that developed world is still more divided than ever, while developing world like us should work more together to find our proper role in a global context. Next, I think is despite all this, the next few years, at least of growth and dynamism, seem to be all right, even remarkable for India. I look at the newspaper yesterday, still growth forecast over 7%. And some ASEAN country, you're right to mention about CL, we at least, Myanmar, I hope also, despite that crisis. So we carry on the story of economic and social dynamism, the rise of middle class. By the time we will celebrate third decade of strategic partnership, I think the next 5 years is still a good time that we will make sure that we work things out that will support this remarkable growth and the rise of Asia, middle income, and the challenges, and from the local to regional and global. Local, like ASEAN, try to make sure about it must be sustainable, inclusive, resilient, and involving the large part of the rural, the population, the poor, the business would be the MSME, that's the civil society, the population, this is a population at large. And regional must be broadened and deepened and substantiate, involving multi-stakeholders, from officials, entrepreneurs, workers, improving further our ways to communicate and network with people. ASEAN talking about the people center, community, people involvement, very important in this regional integration, and from the young, we talk about the young, they're eager to learn and gain knowledge. And the global also need to improve. We must work to overall process, as said earlier. Things that we talking less about this meeting, but I think as it will impact us in a big way about the digital transformation and technology starting to impact more than ever. And in fact, the ASEAN latest summit in Manila has taken seriously this issue and decide to India, which also have a strong point about this area in services, which can be very much strengthened with each other. I think there's at least 3 points among other issues we could address. One is about we're talking about technology disruption for business as much as the job, and adaptation. I think very important. Because we try to address on this, talking a lot about the job, but I think the whole value chain that we're talking, right, this is going to impact in a big way. We cannot expect perhaps part of it. We talk about value chain, that's the so-called the lower cost going to the lower pay country. But the scenario is not always be that way. I mean, that's if the upcoming AI and robotics and all that. Looking at the later example, if you remember the mid of last year, July, August, we're talking about the right at the heart of the, that's Georgia or Atlanta, that's Little Rock, that the former Clinton constituency. Chinese and American firms set up a firm, a textile firm. It's big firm at the very start. The whole factory is robotics, over 300 robots working on textile and produce just they just say that it's an Adidas T-shirt. The cost of the whole section is only 33 cents per T-shirt, and not involve, of course, materials, but this is the process, very low and is going to, that's not debango, but kind of, that's make the way we're looking at the value chain. So this kind of thing means if the Chinese will not come the textile to this region, not only, it might move directly to where the market is. That means developed countries. So this is kind of thing this is a kind of the second issue, not the job, but then also the whole new sense of global value chain, also how it's moving, and it will impact the way we talking. And last issue on this is also about the kind of the divide of this digital transformation, the kind of the new security concern. You're talking about the cyber security, about the people working and aware man machine related. We also deepen a lot of issues, space technology and all this. I think that's the kind of the kind of learning and knowledge we need to catching up very much in this increasing trend. Next one, we already addressed a lot about the there's the rise of Asia. There is also the rise of ASEAN, India, China, but the China is true carry the most weight. You're right that we're still talking about the other ASEAN, perhaps a bit less than 1/4 of China as an economic weight, and adding up to India, perhaps it's making better than 1/4. So China, Asia rise still, China rise, which is still why we're talking about the ASEAN-India partnership. And we know that by 2030, that China is projected to usurp as the world's largest top economy, and India to be number 3, some years later, surpassing Japan. And India expect to also, in terms of population, 2024, is expected to surpass China, the most populous country in the world. So very young, and also compared to very young, but still ASEAN is also to aging country. That's the less is young. Where Singapore and Thailand still be aging country, but it's overall ASEAN is also young. I think talking about the ASEAN-India in an integrated Asia mean to address commonly the rise of China and implication on us. Like I think ASEAN used to address this independence, and we looking back in the 70s, the 80s, we used to address the rise of Japan also, that's in our region, and how the kind of economic independence, not only trade deficit, we try to looking beyond, how then we come to term with. But China, I think this rise is certainly perhaps different from Japan. And it's had both enthusiasm and concern, because it's, I think economic influence, of course, is there. But a stronger political, military, and social democratic presence has been met with more equivocation, uneasy for many, if not outright consternation. So very important for me that in the area of economic, we're looking at new influxes of Chinese investment. And I think here, many parts of the world, but in particular in ASEAN and mainland ASEAN, the new wave of Chinese companies, workers, and migrations that's happening with also the new Chinese project, that's talking about SOEs, high-speed trains, and infrastructure project, Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and all that. So you might say that, well, this is a return to history, that India, China strong, and return to Central Asia. But it might not new. But this time, I think, is because of the economic and social and political machine, perhaps different in terms of the size matters. I think the size matters this round very much. It will be different, perhaps, from the past, in particular the way we connected two borders. Remember that Chinese moving into mainland ASEAN, they've been blocked by mountains, mainly perhaps to Vietnam, that they could come in and Myanmar, and then been blocked somewhere. So they become mountainous tribes and all that. But this round, with the new connectivity, roads, technology make it easy, agreement make it more easy, size factor of people living around it make it more easy. So I think this now it will be much more different and porous border, transboundary, like happened in we talking the past few years while Ambassador and see in Bangkok talking about the Mekong, that's Lan Chang Mekong region. So this kind of thing is we quite concerned, and we need to really address, and that kind of thing that's. I don't know. That India is different, kind of perception. But then, and this is something that perhaps ASEAN India could come to more balanced and help to this kind of partnership. We need also have time to talking about the our attention. We are talking about regional integration, few issues. I think that's Ambassador from Vietnam talking about we need to address market-led integration as well as institution-led. Here we have a few business people, but who address like the firm like market-led integration. But here we're talking about how the institution-led could help that kind of integration. And I would say, I would argue that beyond ASEAN India, the integration we're talking a lot. Next big step, of course, is the RCEP is one, for FTA. And I would argue, I'm not agree with the former session, the chair, who mentioned that there will be a lot of diversion. I think this is the least diversion economic area of the world because we are quite efficient here and there. That's Japan is very good on this, China is very good on this. India is also very good to offer on many things. ASEAN also trying to be. So, developing areas that we could be effective if we use this larger scale, region-wide, and FTA mammoth to make us benefit. And of course, a domestic adjustment we need to make all of us at least at home. So we need to rethink of this kind of partnership and integrate Asia and Asian cooperation. That's perhaps a revisit of thinking of what we and moving along, of course, of economic, political, and social integration in Asia. This is a very important challenge. I think I'd like to live with it. And of course, last not least, as the topic has taken very much in this session, we're talking about the connectivity. What could I add on? Because I agree with everyone that connectivity is still cornerstone of an integrated Asia in addition to other efforts. And as ASEAN already tried to address almost from its first master plan almost 10 years ago. And even for ADB, Ambassador Rajanan know very well, from the beginning of 90s and right at the end of the Cold War to dispel the mistrust, among the GMS countries. So that's why now the mainland ASEAN, the CML TV, we are the Thailand as well, in the macro region are accelerating the improvement of the transboundary logistical and distribution network, and as well as regulatory framework that support very much the integration, trade, investment, movement of people. That's how I think this is also how I think that ASEAN India need also the robust response in the same way as we had done. A concrete example, last year, there's Nippon Express began also offer consolidated transport between Bangkok and Hanoi on fixed schedules. That's and moving even beyond because of the Japanese firm working on the global and regional value chain need to work among the ASEAN countries, and in even moving beyond to Hanoi to southern part of China. Midibas in Ayutthaya, the very big firm, also use that kind of transport, land transport, in addition to what they've done before for maritime transport. So this is in addition to Malaysian and Thai logistical industry that start to do that similar things that offer parts and components in addition to agricultural produce or other things in the region. So I think it's become much more lively, and this will continue to do so. As last point on the connectivity, I think we need to remember also, I mentioned earlier, 2018, intra-regional tariff will be eliminated across CMLV, following the ASEAN 6 had done earlier. So this is a great opportunity that we do not, forget. While both ASEAN India working toward the kind of integrated Asia. And of course, a lot of other things that I'd like to add, but I believe that these today's sessions, we did that sessions, leaving a lot of homeworks that we need to lay down and working forward to improve our ASEAN-India partnership to the future. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Sutipan, for your excellent summing up and also presenting the Thai perspective. You have pushed all the right buttons, ranging from regional integration to RCEP, to connectivity, to cybersecurity, and even commenting somewhat candidly and realistically about the nature of the rise of Asia, and explaining quite honestly, I think, as to what is the role of various actors on all this. Dear friends, I know that this is virtually now the end of the session and probably of the conference. Should you have some appetite still for discussion, I think we all have to be quite fair. And so the floor is now open for some questions or brief comments. And if you wish to a particular panelist to speak on that, please do indicate as well. This is the time for you. Yes, you can start, please.
Thank you, Chair. I have one question. In this whole ASEAN connectivity, are we sufficiently leveraging Asian Development Bank and Japan in terms of funding. And I have one comment. We talked about mode 4 in the IT, particularly in the IT context. The business model we follow in the US requires a lot more emphasis on mode 4. And what we would follow in these countries would be a little different. So can we relook at that whole thing and make both the sides comfortable?
Let me take a couple of more questions. Yes, Manish.
What is wrong with it? Yeah. You know, the talk about in the emerging geopolitical equations in the region, and a speaker from Indonesia, Dr. Phillips, spoke about ASEAN being caught between two belligerent powers and a perception of India as a sort of balancing power and possibly a benign power. For quite some time, there's been this refrain in strategic discourse that India can potentially play a bigger strategic role as a balancing power in ASEAN. In what specific way? I mean, this is a general statement, but in what specific areas you see India playing a bigger role in the strategic arena, given that relations of ASEAN countries, especially economically, so deeply embedded? You know, China is the largest trading partner of all ASEAN countries, right? So how do you offset China's preponderance and virtual economic hegemony, if I can put it that way?
Thank you very much. Maybe one more question? Yes, Uday, please go ahead. I think this will be the last question of the session, please.
You mentioned that there would be, you don't see the emergence of a security architecture in the region at all. Given that we are active in the ADMM Plus and ARF and all that, and there is of course a need for a security architecture in the Indian Ocean region, I was a little intrigued. So could you help me resolve this problem?
Thank you very much. I think this is a good set of questions. Let me request Rajat to please handle the first question about ADB and ASEAN.
You know, one of the paradoxes, I think this is what you're alluding to, is that the countries always say there's a huge need for funding, and the funders like ADB and now AIIB and others basically say, where are the projects? And the challenge is to prepare the project, and this is where Ambassador Wardo's point about the $77 million project preparation phase and others comes in. It has been always sort of a paradox, as I said. These projects take a lot of time and effort and money to prepare. And when I was at ADB, I found it much easier to mobilize 100 million or 250 million or $1 billion for a project, but not get $10 million to prepare the project. And that's why I think the line of the funding that you provided, Anil, and others is very useful. So that's one challenge. The other one is, I think, the infrastructure projects, the hard part is relatively easy. You sort of provide the funds, you lay the road. The software part, the customs regulation, the harmonization. And in GMS, for example, I know that we got the roads built, the corridors, and the protocol for driving license, protocol for single customs were not in place. So the institutional stroke software became the bigger concern. So it is basically those. As I said before, I think there are enough funds available regionally and globally from institutions such as ADB, but also the private sector. Lack of prepared projects is a major concern.
Thank you very much. I think both the question and the answer are significant, and they will remain up in the air, because the fact is that when the business leaders and the government officials look at all this, they say, look, I mean, these are great ideas, but where is the money? Whereas the perspective that you have always projected, not today, but even when you were actually there, is to always say, Rajat would say in a most reassuring manner, money is not the problem. where is the good project? So that is where we are. And may I now request you to take Uday's question, and then we'll go to the ASEAN.
Yes, Uday, let me start by saying that India is very active in ADMM+. So are the others. And that's how we presented a paper on regional security architecture. That paper has been on the table for a number of years now. There's been no change in it. Simply because there's a counter paper by China, there's another paper by Russia. But it's telling that there's no paper by the United States on the table, all right, the major player in the region. If you have to have a security architecture, you have to have views by a major player like the United States. And ASEAN itself, what is ASEAN's view on a regional security architecture? That's not there on the table. So I see a paper like this being refined that I presume can only be done when you have negotiations on the paper. Now, ADMM plus meetings are more in terms of meetings which take place after a year or so, unless they set up a working group on it and then it's elaborated upon and negotiated, you will not have results. Of course, there are many seminars and follow-up events which happen where everybody presents their own viewpoint. So once again, we come back to square one, where there are a number of views on the table, and there's no meeting point. It's a very complex issue to agree upon. The other question I often ask is it in the interest of everybody to have a regional security architecture? I mean, when I ask myself this question, I feel it's not in the interest of everybody, and therefore you will not have agreement. So that's my answer to your question.
And a very good answer, and that is the former insider's answer. An outsider like me would be rather more frank and say that those 3 or 4 adjectives that we always attach with the security architecture, particularly open and inclusive, it does not happen simply because we want it to happen by recitation of mantra. Security architecture has to happen only when there is agreement as to what is the source of insecurity. If there is no agreement, there is no need for security architecture. That agreement escapes us. And now, you heard just now from this panel, when one speaker said that South China Sea has changed almost beyond recognition, and whatever change has taken place is not likely to be undone. Another speaker from ASEAN who said that South China Sea is a hot spot and nobody knows what to do about it. So given that, I think this is the reason why the exercise and the examination of papers and mantra recitation would go on. But countries are now looking at options. They are taking other trajectories, other paths, and I think that was discussed in detail earlier. In the end, dear friends, Manish, veteran journalist, has a very good question, and I request both of you to answer it. Maybe Professor Sutipan, you can speak first. Okay, you hear the answer, then you'll know the question.
Okay. I think I indirectly already mentioned in my remarks that the one area that India can play a bigger role is on the maritime link cooperation. And that includes maritime defense, diplomacy, and so on. And it has to be done in a way of soft balancing against China. That can be used by institutions, IORA or others. So in a way, we are developing some sort of architecture for maritime security that involve some ASEAN countries and India, and through IORA. Why not India help many of these members of IORA build more ports, for example? Earlier in the morning, the chairman of the India Maritime Foundation, the Admiral Now I forgot.
Johan. Oh,
Right,
the one
you're
was
right.
there.
So yeah, he told me during the coffee break that the last time he was, the first time he was in Jakarta was in 1974. His ship stopped at Sabang ports and Belawan ports. That's on the tip of Aceh province. Now that ports are actually